Thank you. Thank you. It's just such an honor to be here and to see all of you here. Saturday was packed, Wednesday was packed, today, Sunday. It's just truly a blessing to be here with all of you to share my work and the collective vision of Cheryl Finley, who has been a partner in many projects for a number of years. But I also like to acknowledge two of my besties that are here. And if you could stand up, Chandra and Keith, that from New Orleans. They are the two busiest photographers that I know. And then another good friend, Gerard Mouton, can you stand? From New Orleans. When I started my research back in the 80s, 70s, they were always circling with me, helping me, guiding me through time, teaching me how to pronounce names. So that's something Gerard was constantly making sure that I said names correctly from New Orleans. But the idea of this project started with Cheryl Finley and the Photo Focus in Cincinnati. And I worked through projects as we started thinking about how do we tell a story about the archive and how to begin this story. I'd like to start just sharing that as a professor, curator, writer, artist, and photographer, as well as a mother. Growing up in Philadelphia, I've always been interested in the notion of the archive and the multiple ways to enter the archive. And so when we think about searching for ways to share stories about family, about Black life, about life in America, it's crucial to think about how photography is central to that story. I'm going to walk you through some images that I have collected, but also some of my own images. And I just want to share one that touches my heart, in many ways. And this image here is Deb Willis in 1974 at Duke Ellington's memorial service, funeral service at St. John's Divine. A photographer reached out to one of my colleagues, younger colleagues at NYU, and said, "Is this Deborah Willis?" And she's like, I don't know. And to me, I'm like, she sent it to me. I was traveling. She said, "There's a man here who has a photograph of you he'd like to give to you." And I was truly honored because I'm carrying my first camera. I'm an undergraduate student in Philadelphia, traveling to New York to attend this service. Could not get in, but I had images. I had a camera, and I can't find my negatives from that camera, but to know that experience I was documented from the other side of the crowd just really touches my heart. And here I'm standing, then I looked in the crowd and I see some of the older photographers like Lou Draper and Gerald Straw and some other photographers who were part of my understanding about photography and during that time. And just fashion. We think about what I was documenting at that time. And I want to meet the photographer one day. I'm going to go to California and meet the photographer because I'm curious what he had before and after. There must be more on that sheet. But what I found fascinating was the people who were honoring Duke Ellington and attending the funeral, but the dress of the style of the entertainers during that time. And finding covers for the book of this exhibition, Free as They Want to Be. It is Lisa Butler's quilt that we recreated in a photograph because Toledo Museum of Art said we couldn't travel it after the first site. They said they want to save and conserve the texture of the image. And so we work closely with the photographer to identify a image, a photographer, a lab that could make the photograph look as if it was a part of the quilt. And on the cover of the last book that I worked on, it's the 25th anniversary of this book, Reflections in Black, a Reframing. It's a story that I started as an undergraduate school where I was told that there were no Black photographers worthy to be in history books. And I just could not believe it because I grew up around photography. My father was an amateur photographer. Our neighbor was a journalist, photojournalist for the press in Philadelphia. And my father's cousin had a studio. So I was curious about it. And this is in the 70s. And then in 69, I remember attending the Harlem on My Mind exhibition and saw James Van Der Zee's photograph. So I questioned the context of there is no Black photographers. I also questioned that, and I decided to write a grant and ask for a course reduction so that I could work on a semester-long project on Black photographers. And that's how I met Keith and Chandra, and just trying to find photographers that were around the country that I could include in the book. But recently, as I told one of the wonderful board members, Jasmine, that I've been working in the closet. I photograph closets, and if any of you are interested in me photographing your closets, let me know. I enjoy looking at stories that we find in the closet. You know, there are clothes that we can't wear, there are objects that we save, but we also have stories about moments when we wear certain things or save certain things in the closet. Who knew that my mother saved my father's yearbook, high school yearbook, in the closet? And we just found, my mom lived to 100 and she died 2 years ago. And we found Daddy's yearbook. And the unbelievable that we found this. And in this, it says his interest was photography, which didn't know, and that he wanted to see the world. My father traveled the world often, and that Tom was going to do well. This is basically what they noted in that. So in terms of our closets, we think about the official archives that we entered to write history. Our closets have many of those stories. My dad, my sister was born in 1946. My dad after being in the war, World War II, he bought this house on the corner. And this is my dad on the left. He also sang in a chorale. And after he passed, we found, of course, a number of photographs. And this is the day my sister was born. My mom was in labor. He did not believe she was in labor. He was playing pinochle with his friends. My mom is in the bedroom with her grandmother. And he says it's not time because she was 3 months premature. But he was going out, and he photographed this moment. And so my son, everyone always connects the two of them looking alike. And he decided to stand on that corner, and same corner where we grew up. And then I started photographing in Philadelphia, going back to our old neighborhood and documenting the neighborhood. And this is the house that the brick covered. Daddy covered the brick. And to our embarrassment, my sister and I said, why? And then I'm looking with the red wall here, it works. Just thinking about how he felt about color and changing, and the stories of North Philadelphia are found here. And also the stories in North Philadelphia through my father's lens. We see our family photographs. He was also, he was a policeman, he had a tailor shop, but he also had, as they say today, he was an interior decorator, which means he was a paper hanger. And he used to create calendar images for every year. And he used our family photographs and where the backdrop is the wallpaper that he had over time. And so here we are, my sister, I'm holding a black doll, my sister's holding a white doll, my mom is holding us. And then the center image is the image that my dad gave me a camera when I was young, and it was a Brownie. And this is the image I photographed of our Christmas tree. And so at 6 making a photograph, 7 making a photograph, and discovering photography was part of it. And I just love discovering this image again, but also finding different stories. The fact that we love celebration of Christmas, all the packages are wrapped, the cards. So we see family life in different ways. And here, my dad's playing the card. He has the tie on, and he's smacking my uncle's hand to, no, you can't have this. So I had an opportunity to just live in a family with full of love, and his brothers are around him and his brother-in-law as they play cards, and my uncles are just having joyful time. In Philadelphia, Dad worked in South Philadelphia in the market, the Italian market, and this is Dad in Philly. Family photographs, he always teased me because I was always on the phone, and our phone was public. It was right in the living room, so dining room could not have a private conversation. But my mom went to beauty school, the Apex Beauty School, and so we had art on the wall. We also had Mom's diploma from the school, but also, again, how he used flowers. I mean, he loved flowers in terms of wallpaper. He loved creating in the yard. And here we are in the kitchen. And so this idea of kitchen tables and storytelling. And one of the other images I wanted to share from family album, but connecting to the possibilities of storytelling through Gordon Parks's photograph. And this image here is an image of Ellen, her dress, the fontanelles. And this image is so significant to me because I see our dresses are very similar. And he's photographing poverty in America. That Bessie Fontanelle is ironing a dress that she's using this as making sure that her daughter is safe when she attends school and when she's entering school, even though they're poor, lack of food, lack of space to do homework, but she's dressed as armor. And that's how I see that she is preparing her child to enter into a public school, but also Gordon Parks, who was creating the story about life and poverty, but also love and respect in Harlem. So this is the project statement that my son found in my closet that I was so surprised that he identified it. And here are the list of photographers that I wrote to my chair at the time that I wanted to meet: Gordon Parks, Medita Sleet. There are a number of other photographers that I identified. And as I wrote this, and this is my professor, Ann Tucker, who encouraged me to do the work. And here we're at Philadelphia College of Art during the 70s. And a moment in terms of how do we think about this history and the past. The early photographers that I identified, that I, in school working. And my first photograph that I made as an undergraduate student is this image here on South Street. Again, family, looking out the window and just reimagining the stories of there's an uncle or grandfather, there's a mother, there's a sister, checking on their children who are playing on the streets in South Philly. And to think about migration, this is North Carolina barbecue shop that's right under, and I have that sign, it's that store next to them. But thinking about this history, and one of the images that I made in the 70s, and was another discovery as I began to think about my work and my photography that I'm going to try to do more and more. And here is that story, how stories were told. I was always fascinated in histories, and as Keith and Chandra know the history of memory, historical memory. I was fascinated with storytelling, and to think about how many stories of loss are told, how they're reframed. But I'm interested in how people read cards and how people read signs. And this is a reading of two Haitian women. She's reading the cards of this woman who is dealing with a broken heart. And so I photographed this moment and felt it was important for me to see how we share stories, not only through the evidence of true life, but then the evidence of that other life that we also experience. I started photographing in our neighborhood, and then my husband's from South Carolina, and then photographing the history of his family as we think about homegoing services. And here are some of the images from that experience in Florence, South Carolina. Having that experience of death and thinking about history and how we preserve memory is when my dad died. We had ties. We had so many ties. This is called Daddy's Ties. And we gave Dad ties during Christmas, birthdays, Father's Day, all the time. And he wore them lovingly, and some too long. I would say, that's too wide a tie, Dad. You can't wear that anymore. But he also, I found photographs of him in the war, on the beaches in Atlantic City, but then also when he won awards over time. And so my sister, my mother, and I worked together in creating Daddy's Ties. Those ties were important for me to think about how protected families are, how protected the stories about family life, history, and to think about this image here. This is an image in Memphis, Tennessee, where a mother is taking her son first day of school, integrating the school. And we see a mother who's dressed very fashionably. She has a bow on her dress. She probably has auntie and grandmother with her, and this sense of armor. How do we dress and use dress as armor? See me as human. And here she is confronted with a mother, a white mother whose arms are folded as if she's going to block them through the door. I can't imagine the conversation that happened in that moment with grandmom and auntie and mother and the young son walking through this story. So here the young girls are looking to the side and thinking about what kind of confrontation to have. But these are moments of how motherhood is central in terms of protecting. There's an exhibition that has traveled designing motherhood, and this was on display at the Art Museum, the Museum of Art and Design in New York. And as I tell the story, when I was a undergraduate student, I was told by a male professor that I was taking up a good man space, that 18 men were in that classroom. There were only 3 women. And all I was going to do is get pregnant, get married, and a good man could have been in that space. And so he attempted to shame me, attempted to deny me of my desire of wanting to be a photographer, which I wanted to since I was 7 or 8 years old. And again, the experience of my son going through my closet saying I had too many things. He found the contact sheet, and the contact sheet were the last 3 images on the contact sheet. And he said, Mom, why have you ever, why didn't you print this before? I've never seen this image. And, what's happening? What happened here? And I told him my husband and I did a self-portrait, and Hank and I did a collaboration at Brandywine Workshop. And here we see this moment of where I said, you took accusation that I took space from a good man, and I end up by saying I made space for a good man. And so how women are telling these stories, and there are many stories in this exhibition about motherhood and work and art in that way. He decided to also work together with me and look and notice that everyone, when we traveled around often, we'd see people and they said, "Oh, are you Hank's mom?" And then Hank will say, "Are you Hank's Deb's son?" And so then we were trying to figure out how people view us in a sense. So he put our faces together in the center image, and it was the most amazing experience to gasp as I see that our faces merged, and here we are, looking just alike, and it was eerie and beautiful at the same time. We collaborated on projects, and this is a most recent project here in Montgomery Square in Alabama, where the image of Rosa Parks. So he used my hands, truly honored, to create this monument for Rosa Parks in Alabama. So it took a while to to get used to holding that for a minute, but just the idea of having to collaborate with my son, to work on projects together as an artist, but also to honor Rosa Parks in this area. We've worked on different projects together, and then stories developed over time as I taught photography, as I began to curate shows. One of the photographers I work with is Tyler Mitchell, and he's also looking at family. And we think about family and through ancestors, he's entering in family homes and how family photographs create a dimension of life. And the contemporary image on the left in Coney Island in Brooklyn, and then on the right of a family in Brooklyn, but thinking a family who migrated from St. Vincent. And here we see these images. That Delphine Fulundu also, her family migrated from Liberia and lived in other parts of Brooklyn and traveled around the world finding home. And here's an image of her grandmother whispering to her stories about life, but also using the fabric that her grandmother tie-dyed and made the dress that she's wearing now. And thinking about stories about home is something that's a part of my story, that I was inspired by visiting Keith and Chandra in New Orleans to photograph shotgun houses. And so I began photographing shotgun houses. I started here in South Carolina, and then I also photographed thinking about beauty in homes. How do we design homes that we see challenges, or how do we deal with be courageous when we know we're living a difficult life? And this is in Johannesburg, South Africa. So when I think about color, this is green, this is blue, there was a yellow house, but I also found the beauty that people were looking for and how to identify beauty in these homes. And this is one of the homes that I photographed with Keith and Chandra guiding me through the lower ninth. And I don't know if this house still, did it survive? It's gone, right. We photographed this before Katrina. And I loved, we stopped. It was just in a moment that how important was for this family to document this house, but also see the sense of citizenship and use politics as a way of framing this house. Clotheslines I found really fascinating because growing up, you see the workers' clothes. You see the people who lived had to wear certain colors to work. But we see also what it meant to use images to tell stories about life of women who could talk over the clothesline, share stories, prepare for dinner, but also prepare for activism and in their communities, and how clotheslines became kind of convention centers for people who had backyards. And another person that I photographed using the home theory and series is Ms. Nandi's house. She was the lady who would give, the candy store lady that I always remember growing up in Philadelphia. There was a candy store right outside of Sunday school, and you'd always want to buy some candy just to get through the service. And and then, you know those little rap, you can hear your grandmother rapping you, trying to keep you quiet. Well, Ms. Nandi had jars, and she was an older lady in the house. But she also taught children. When they entered the house, they had to do homework before they had the candy. They shared stories. And so raising the children, not on her own, they would send photographs. All the children who she met over time, she lived in a house for over 30 years, and she honored them, their altar. She talked about photographs of historical figures, and we see the importance of their lives. And it was important for her to share their life, their own life with them and with her. And so that experience I wanted to share. And then again, colors, how colors are seen in these houses. This is in North Philadelphia. And imagine the children climbing these stairs, but they're climbing them not only for candy, but for education, for nourishment. and for this sense of knowledge that she offered in Philly. And here is Miss Nandi with her husband. And unfortunately, they passed away just recently. And so we see all of the figures. We have, the Nation of Islam. We see Christianity. We see vocalists from jazz singers to Dr. King and President Kennedy, all of the photographs that she lived through, but she gave hope in the family, in the communities of the families that she documented. And also with my mom, this is my mom's hands, and she's 98, and so it's titled Ruth's Bible. And to see the determination that I wanted to document, a woman who lived a life in sharing the community, but also raising a community of women, but also people in the community who just needed mothers over time. And so her belief in documenting her hands. And also faith. This is a woman who was formerly incarcerated. And just to see her belief in her way of raising and believing that when she left imprisonment, she had her hands tattooed Faith, which is her name, and she found a place for women who often returned, had nowhere to go. And she said when she left incarceration, she had nowhere to go, no one to guide her into education, to food ways, to home life. And so she created a space for women. And so I wanted to photograph her and just her hands and just the beauty that she offered in this experience. I worked with a former student, a graduate student, who was also looking at images of people who were formerly incarcerated. And we documented, we made photographs of them in the studio of clothes that they possibly wore when they were in prison, and then also how they wanted to be seen now. So there's a sense of being stigmatized, and then the sense of resilience, and their words is a mural in Philadelphia of all of these faces on 21st Street. And it was an opportunity for us to collaborate in many ways with the Mural Arts Project, but also to have words such as dignity, beacon, be a catalyst. The things that they were asking that they wanted to see in themselves, we used the words on the wall. And here's my closet project. So there's Lana, a friend who lives in Harlem. This is her opera dress that she wore going to see someone at the Met. And then another woman who didn't have a closet, a young woman who didn't have a closet, lived in a studio, but her bathroom was her closet. And this is a dress that she wore the day that she was engaged, her boyfriend, and expressed his desire to marry her. And so we work with that image. So as you can see, these are the number of projects I worked over time, different book projects. As Gerard laughed when he heard me chuckle when the guys on the interview said that you had 20 books, and I have not counted, but these are some of the images. And I thought also how important it was for me to have women on the cover of the books, and having these projects over time and to continue. And Jasmine, that's in Pursuit of Beauty, the Closet Project with the shoes. And, having to work with history and memory is, Carrie Mae Weems is significant. Here she's using an antebellum dress, and she photographed here in Louisiana, the project. And she's looking into history and asking the question, I looked and looked to see what so terrified you. And she recognizes her beauty, and she sees her beauty, and she wonders and ponders over that. With this exhibition, we also work with Isaac Julian. And Isaac Julian is looking at 19th century photographer James Presley Ball, who photographed Frederick Douglass. And here he recreates actors as center actors as Frederick Douglass, and on the left, J.P. Ball, and then Frederick Douglass's wife. And here, thinking about how do we think and look for the future. And these are some of the images that I found over time. Frederick Douglass's newspaper actually published an article about J.P. Ball in the 19th century. And this is J.P. Ball's studio in Cincinnati. And we see the openness of it. The images are at the West Baton Rouge Museum, and you'll see many of them. He also created and recreated and reimagined J.P. Ball deciding on the image, making the photograph, and then Frederick Douglass deciding on the image that he wanted to select to represent him. Frederick Douglass is known as having over 270 images made over his, he's the most photographed man in the 19th century. And we see he creates this, he's in the National Portrait Gallery in London, and he used period dress, but we have a J.P. Ball standing in the back approving, and then also the image of Frederick Douglass's wife and Anna Douglass. But also that he worked with a portrait painter, Duncanson, and we see that they had reproduced the Duncanson painting and the backdrop. So, photographers and artists are looking for different ways to tell the story, but also looking for ways to explore the struggle, but also the beauty in these images. And we see here again with Bisa Butler and Harriet Tubman, how she enlivens the image of a color and making the quilt out of this image. This is the image that she used of Frederick Douglass. And we know descriptions of Frederick Douglass as this beautiful, handsome man, over 6 feet, but we've never seen a photograph of him full standing portrait. And so she reimagines him and standing and his height, but also that his wife designed many of his clothes and suits. And so then she decided to think about the way he traveled and using West African fabric and that story. She also used Gordon Parks's photographs, as you can see in the image in the other gallery. And this image here in Mobile, Alabama in the 50s, the colored entrance. And the story, of this story, the image of segregation in the South during the 50s. And she created this as a quilt. Omar Victor Diop is a photographer who works in West Africa and in France. And he is also looking at Frederick Douglass because he's looking at how Black men in the 19th century traveled. They traveled as abolitionists. They told stories about freedom and struggle. And he's comparing how today, when Black people travel internationally, they're in sports. They're very rarely talking about freedom in this sense. And then he uses the idea of sports and just kind of icons like this whistle. And he has some with football players, but the whistle for Frederick Douglass as keeping us alert of what's happening in our lives and how to awaken us in our consciousness in these stories. He also had someone make a wig to create the style of hair that Frederick Douglass was known for in his photographs. Daisha Harris, we see her image here on the wall on the left, and One More River to Cross. And thinking about spirituality and spirituals, and thinking also of Harriet Tubman and the aspect of where do we begin to think about and represent freedom? How do we find ways to cut one more river to cross to believe that you're going to move north to Canada? And here she recreates this water as people traveled through water, through spiritual songs, and how they made it through. And here she recreates that moment in the north. Deborah Jack from St. Martin, and she is thinking about how people travel to the Caribbean for relaxation and fun and, good times. But she's also asking for, the evidence of what happens with the wounds of when there's a hurricane or the aspect of climate change. And so she is using multiple images as well as video to recreate the experience of pleasure, but also the wounds of the past. And Monica de Miranda here lives in Lisbon, and here she's thinking and also considering the experience of women who travel. They travel from the Caribbean from Angola to Lisbon and through different parts of the world, listening to stories and then hearing the sounds of the water. And the water echoes different experiences for each. Renee Cox is also looking at the Caribbean and then thinking here of the Maroons in Jamaica, and how Nanny of the Maroons had to create a community, over time, and she's prepared as she holds the sword, but also the aspect of the uniform. And that community in Jamaica is still lively and important to that history. Adama Delphine Fulundu is also looking at the newspapers over time. And she's looking and incorporating her face, the back of her hair, as a child, as a woman, looking at the Black Star Line, looking at the Black press as a storytelling moment about the unfortunate death of Black people in work, but also creating a quilt, as we could see in the West Baton Rouge Museum, that she created a freedom quilt and just wonderful images of women in honor of Shirley Chisholm. And we see here with Wendell White, who is also going into historical archives, making photographs, working with the librarians and ask questions about images that were central to telling the different stories about people's lives. And this is in upstate New York, photographs of Mr. and Mrs. Logan. And just the idea that, I'm not sure if Wendell was aware of it, but also that Frederick Douglass' son married Mrs. Logan's daughter. And so I want to remind him of that story that I had over time. And Frederick Douglass, as I mentioned, is the most photographed man in the 19th century, but then there's a lock of his hair that's in the archive. And, family images that people are saving and sharing in public archives. Elaine Rodriguez is just thinking about Oshun and thinking about West African spirituality, and also within the Caribbean as well as in West Africa and this country. And how do we birth generations of revolutionary women, through waterways. Nona Faustine also thinking about women who did not survive the Middle Passage, some who survived the Middle Passage, and just thinking about how the water, the rocks that stopped them, and facing George Washington on the auction block. Willie Williams here, and this is in, I think Mobile, right? Mobile Bay, Alabama. And he's photographing Civil War sites and documenting where Black men fought, Black men died, and just making these amazing images and stories about photography from that period. Kathy Opie is also looking at monuments, and when we think about monuments of people over time, that what is monument, what is monumental? So she's asking the question, and then when the Richmond, Virginia, there was a protest there, and then she decided to document the protests, the signs of the language of the people who wanted to talk back to, that was on the avenue there in of the monuments in Richmond, Virginia. And there's a series of 7 images, but this is the images that's traveling here. And these are the other image. images in that, 7 long images that from sunset to dawn, she photographed traveling around the country, looking for images of monuments and what was monument, what she considered what was monument and what was monumental. Sheila Tree Bright, here again, she's in the back wall, but again, thinking about the struggle, but also to think through the story of this is the unfinished monument that, in terms of the experience of the war, the Civil War, and she was documenting living there over a time period. And the story is that how do we think about the invisible empire that's still a part of our lives? And she created a landscape that included cotton, waterways, and the Bible as a sense of spirituality to keep the life of and hope of the people in the Atlanta area, and the imposing aspect of how do we see that monument as a central figure. Work is another way of looking through the work of Dawood Bey, and Dawood Bey is also photographing and thinking about the Middle Passage, the memory of the Middle Passage, but also the memory of freedom through night struggles, through the freedom trails. And so as they think about the North Star, he's photographing at night, large format camera, and reimagining the lives of people who traveled through these thick woods and roots, waterways, and the determination of these people who made sure that their families would have freedom. And when we think about A Night Come Tenderly, that they're praying specifically that they make it through the Underground Railroad and to see ways of freedom through the dreaming of a new life, of freedom in the North. Carrie Mae Weems is thinking about down here below as she's photographs on her back, camera up, looking at the clouds. Again, this concept of dreaming, a concept of thinking about a new life and new hope. And this is Hank Willis Thomas's photograph, and his image is photographing in the archive of the Gordon Parks Foundation. And this image is, again, a Gordon Parks image from his Learning Tree film, where he's looking at the hurricanes, again, the weather of that time period. How do we understand weather, and how do we visualize the experience of weather through the experience of the exodusters, and how do we exit these experiences of the past, exit these difficult travel routes and travel ways, but also deal with the weather, with segregation, deal with the lynch mobs, and all of the many stories that we see in the sense of how this story is told. And he uses lenticular print, and when you walk through this image, you stand to the left, to the right, and you can feel the movement of the wind and the movement of the figure. Lava Thomas is also using photographic images to make portraits, but also graphite and pencil. And how do we think about recommitting to the work of a figure, like Harriet Tubman in her later years? And this is just one silent image that we began to feel and understand that this portrait was a way for her to see courage and bravery and equality and freedom. And this is where she's honoring this. As we think about monument and monumental, she's creating a monumental portrait. And this is work by Sadie Burnett, whose dad was in the military in the 60s, and he was also a Black Panther Party member. He was also was under surveillance by the FBI. And she, out of the Freedom Act of the FBI papers, she was able to make wallpaper out of some of the documents that were redacted and stories about her dad and made wallpaper and created a story about his life as a freedom fighter for civil rights, but also a fighter for American rights in the war in Vietnam. And so here is Dear 1968, and as she begins the work, and she says that she created this historical tapestry, and through going through the FBI, my father, FBI's file, Project 3, there are 28 pages of black and white images, papers, and creating this. And this image here just is this amazing story of, Genevieve Gagnon. Again, as we think about what do we take with us when there is a storm, when we have to leave, not only this country, but in other people who are migrating for freedom. And as she wears her 19th century dress, she's connecting to freedom. And we see the two pictures of Dr. King and how we see the Kennedy image and how the sense of hope is carried through the woods again as we begin to think about the thickness of this search for freedom, the understanding of being a trailblazer, and how these two, as she uses this figure. And this is also in the West Palm Beach. I don't know why I keep saying that. West Baton Rouge Museum. And images, as I end this talk, we focus on some of my students' work. Zalika Azim, whose family moved from South Carolina, the Gullah culture in South Carolina, to Brooklyn, finding after her grandmother passed away, that her grandmother was a photographer. She never knew her grandmother was a photographer. She traveled north, and some of the images that she placed are some of the images that her grandmother made. And so these sense of stories are found. Tyler Mitchell was the first black photographer on the cover of Vogue, and he is a former student of mine. But he also is using domestic stories to tell, and using this image, using the clothesline and the reflection of hair as a way of style, and the blooming hair of the wonderful flowers. But it also connects to family, work, and the clothesline. And here we begin to think about Maud Salter, who's on the cover of this book, and how its way of looking at the photography from the 19th century and using the daguerreotype case. And finally, my image here, reflections on Joan Baez's Civil War. And this is this image here where I had an installation of Civil War soldiers, of over 300 images as wallpaper. And I had not connected, but one person who attended one of my talks said, "Are you honoring and channeling your dad's work?" And I hadn't thought about it, but I guess I am in terms of thinking about this. Okay, so we'll have a chance to respond to questions. But the image, the video, when you have a chance to see, Joan Baez is working on a project of her last album, and she invited 10 artists to respond to a song, and one of the songs was the Civil War song. And it wasn't about the American Civil War, but looking at this, when you hear and listen to the video, you'll see that it reflects on images of Civil War soldiers, freedom. We have a choreographer dancing and performing with the music, and it's just a wonderful story of struggle and hope, and also beauty in the way that we created this exhibition, working closely with Carla Williams as well as with the artists in the exhibition, but also with the artists here in the exhibition. As you'll see, they're just wonderful moments as you'll see the local artists here. It is an honor to be here with all of you today. Thank you.